Hello, thank you for joining me today. I'll be going over some shading techniques, and all you need to follow along at home is grab a pencil and some paper. Okay, and here we go with our paper and pencil. I will be using a 2B pencil today, but you could certainly use one that is on the softer side or on the harder side, or whatever you have laying around the house is just fine. It is good to experiment a little bit further down the road once you get comfortable with shading to really see what kind of result it will yield when you use a softer lead as opposed to a harder lead. But for today, we'll keep it simple. We'll just be using one pencil, and I'll give you an idea of some of the other tools that we could use to shade later. But for now, let's make a mark on our page. And to see how simple that was, I used this pencil to apply that material, and then I stopped. And we typically think of our drawing tools and our paintbrushes as an applicating device, where it's just dispensing that mark onto the surface. However, it usually doesn't stop there. And in the manipulation of the material on the surface is where the real magic happens. So to do that with our pencil here and create some shading effects, first what we want to do is really focus on pressure control. So I pressed fairly hard to make this bold mark here, but if I just barely skim on the surface and just give a light tickle, see how soft and whispery my mark is? I can go even lighter, and sometimes it's really fun and exciting to see what is the lightest mark I can possibly make without hovering above the page and not touching it. It's a really good exercise in muscle control, because usually when we start writing and drawing, we really want to grind that tool into the paper surface so that we make that mark. But we don't have to go so far, and it can be much harder to control what we're doing when we're using so much pressure. If we're just lightly gliding over the surface, things get to be much more smooth, but also if we need to erase something, well, that works way better than if we try to erase this really heavy-handed stuff over here. Usually there's some indentation in the paper. Even if we use our hardiest eraser, even if we really work it, there's still going to be a groove in the surface or a little bit of that graphite left behind. And I briefly sketched out a little gradient here, and that is going to be a series of different values going from very dark to very light. Values are the varying degrees of lightness and darkness, and it provides us with a scale. It's really fun to do too. And just kind of starting on either end, you could start super dark and then ease up the pressure, or you can start super light and then slowly increase the amount of pressure that you're using. It's even good to practice both ways. So here I started very dark, and then as I move, I use less and less pressure, and try it the opposite way. I'm just going to start with a light little tickle, and then as I move, I'm adding more and more pressure onto the surface. And now we can also see a difference between what I just did, where I used one continuous mark, but I was pressing more on the point of the pencil, and it created some of these little gaps and streaks. And on my larger gradient here, I achieved something smoother, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, I held my pencil more on the side. Instead of using the tip, I was using a flatter application. See how my strokes are broader to begin with? But then, if I go back and forth and add more layers to that shaded area, again, it becomes smoother and more consistent, and those little streaky marks go away as I work into the surface. Much smoother. This is something that we're usually going for. However, it's nice to experience both, because there are some situations where you will want things to be a little bit more separated. There's another technique as well. Instead of going back and forth in the same direction, you can choose to shade over in another layer, but going in an opposite direction. And this is what we call cross-hatching. It's sort of weaving our marks together, and the overlap creates that smoothness as well. And we can change up and go diagonally, as well as sideways and up and down too, to achieve that cross-hatching effect. It's good to keep in mind though that we want to be sparing and just do a little at a time, because if we go too far too fast, then we end up with something very dark. And now the only way to really mesh that in with everything else is by making everything else a little bit darker as well. It's all relative, it's all interrelated. Everything is defined by the things around it and the parts within it. And this really helps to train our eye for looking for those things, but it also trains our hand to respond. And once things get super dark, as you could probably guess, it's very, very hard to remove, if not sometimes impossible to remove completely. You have a little bit of a ghost mark left over where it was super dark. So a little goes a long way, and we could always add more. It's just much more difficult to add less. All right, so now I've set us up with some more graphite on a new page here, just by laying down some pencil on the surface in a similar way as before. I do have a gradient here that's still a little bit liney, it's a little bit streaky, so I want to fix that up. And I don't always necessarily want to keep adding more. Even if I have a very good control of the amount of pressure that I'm using, sometimes I need a little bit more help to make things nice and smooth. Over here, I even laid one down that was very, very dark on either side and very light inside, but it's a very choppy, very, very quick transition from dark to light to dark, and I want something to be smoother. Not everything in nature is a gradient. Sometimes it's a bit more complex than that. You would be surprised how many gradients you can find in the real world once you really look carefully. But here we have a couple of different scenarios that we can work with, which leads us to our next tool, which is friction. Friction is very, very important. It's a very important element of nature, and just as a lot of other scientific principles can be applied to art, this one is very important. Friction allows us to achieve that manipulation that I mentioned earlier, of kind of pushing that pencil around on the surface, stretching it out, pulling it across, and really getting exactly what we want. So let's use a tool that most of us have plenty of, fingers. I'll use my finger and I'll go ahead and just start rubbing on the surface of the paper. I could use a circular motion like I'm using here. I can start to kind of pull that material downward. Since my gradient is going from dark to light, I'll move in that motion. And just as I was lifting up and applying less pressure once I get to the lighter area, I can do the same thing with my finger. See how nice and dirty it is? Ooh, that's good. That means that I won't be lifting up so much more of the material as I will be pushing it around. If I use a clean finger, I may remove more than I want to. But if I want to go in and blend a very light area, then I want to use one of my cleaner fingers to do that. And sometimes we get different values on each finger, which is great. It's like our fingers become drawing tools as well. And we can really go back and forth and use exactly what we need until we get the desired effect that we're looking for. In this one, since I have a really abrupt change from dark to light and then back to dark, what I want to do, instead of going over the whole entire thing like I did here, I can kind of just polish over the edge of where those two values meet. Kind of like smoothing over the parts of the clay that were just joined, where there's usually a groove or a bump, some sort of a seam there. And then after I blend that through, if it's not quite moving anymore, then that means that I need to lay down more material, and I can go ahead and add more pencil to the surface to further smooth over that difference. And I can go back and forth and blend that in, and then I could add a little more. And then I can blend that in. And cross-hatching with my finger, going in the opposite direction that I used with the pencil. And we can really fine-tune it by going gradually into the direction that we're aiming for. And now I'll just introduce you to a few tools other than our pencil that you can consider. They're not absolutely necessary for drawing, but they can really help you achieve precision and or softness and the whole scale of everything in between. If you want a lot of precision and you want to use a very fine point, a mechanical pencil could be an interesting choice. However, you won't be able to tilt your pencil on the side and get that broad surface area to get that smooth blending. So this is better suited to smaller, finer detail that usually comes further on into the process of your drawing. There's also this mechanical pencil, which has a thicker lead, or sometimes they're referred to as lead holders. And there are different types that are available, but this one you can actually use a lot of the lead without having to do a lot of fancy, complicated sharpening. And by holding it on its side, you can go ahead and achieve that surface area shading effect. Also, we already showed our white plastic eraser here, which is the best thing to use if you want to remove a mark completely, especially when you're working with graphite pencil. This will remove the most of your mark. And then there are other variations that are available, some smaller retractable versions that give you a little bit more precision, but essentially it's the same type of eraser. And then the kneaded eraser is nice because it is pliable. It's great for really grimy materials such as charcoal or soft pastel, where you have a lot of dusty stuff going on. These white plastic erasers, they tend to get coated very quickly and then they just become a smearing device. Whereas with the kneaded eraser, all you have to do is squeeze it and twist it. You're kneading it like dough, which is how it gets its name. And every time you give it a pinch and a squeeze and a twist, it's cleaned up and it's fresh for you. You could even shape it into different edges to achieve different marks. If you want to use this as a drawing tool to remove the material and make lighter marks, you can do that as well, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to do that. And then for blending, to go back to our friction and our shading and really stretching the material across the surface, we could use certain things like paintbrush here. The very, very soft ones, I like to use the rounded tips, and that will help create a very soft shading effect. Tortillions or blending stumps, this is a blending stump. Tortillions look a little bit more like a rolled paper where you can see the seam in between the rolls. They're both essentially just compacted paper, and you could use that to pull and stretch the material across the surface as well. And then super simple, we could use a little bit of tissue or toilet paper, something very soft will give us a soft blending. Or with the paper towel, because it's a little bit more toothy, it has more texture to it, it's stiffer, so it tends to give a little bit more of a textured effect when we're shading with that. All right, now let's test out some of these shading devices that I just mentioned. Each of them will give a different effect, so it's good to really know what to expect when you're using these with your drawings. Even something like the paper, we can take it for granted that paper will always behave in a certain way because paper is paper is paper. However, that's not true. The thickness of the paper can affect the way that you're shading. The surface of the paper can affect that as well. And there are papers that are made smoother and more textured for this purpose exactly. So if you're going for something particular, it's always good to set up some kind of a little science lab and experiment and test out what you mean to do before you do it. And that will really minimize a lot of the heartache, a lot of the margin for error, and a lot of the potential to end up, spending more time and energy than we really want to or are able to. So first, let's do with our kind of streak of pencil here that I've made. I made it nice and rich and dark so we can start pulling that across the surface and see how each of these work. And I'll just start with my finger since my finger's nice and grimy and dirty, and that is a valuable tool. If you're using a lot of hand blending, just know that you are introducing a little bit of the oils from your skin onto the paper. However, unless you're working for, months, days, years on the same picture and you're going over the same area again and again, chances are you aren't going to have any serious problems with the paper deteriorating for archival purposes. So here we go with our finger. I'm just grabbing and pulling that material across. You can see how there's quite a bit of a mark that makes, even though I'm not applying with the pencil in this area at all. It's nice and quiet, it's nice and smooth, and I'm really pushing into the paper. And I could use more and more pressure if I want to pull more and more graphite. And because of the softness of my finger and the very fine tooth of this paper, it's nice and smooth. So next, let's use this brush here. This is going to be very, very quiet and subtle. And sometimes we even need to lay down more than we think that we need for this to take effect. Or if you're using a very, very soft material, like a super soft charcoal, for example, or a soft pastel, this will have way more impact than on the graphite here. You see how it's just a soft whisper? So for something like this, where we want it to just be the quietest, softest, very, very pale area, this will work very well for that, to create that very pale whisper. Next, let's use our blending stump here, or a tortillon would work in the same way. It's made of paper, and actually if it gets really grimy from a lot of use, you can take a fresh piece of sandpaper and go ahead and rub it on there to freshen it up and reinforce that tip. But some people do like to kind of push the tip into the surface and round it out on purpose. But again, just like with every drawing tool, the more you use it, the more you'll get a feel for what really works for you. And knowing how to modify your tools will help you get to where you want to be that much more easily. So let's go ahead with this. So I'm grabbing that pencil and I'm pulling it over. And I'm only working in one direction so that I get that gradient. If I go back and forth, then I end up having a dark area on both sides of my mark, which sometimes is desirable, but when we're shading, it's usually a good idea to just go in one direction to maintain that control. And it tends to be a bit more bold in the mark that it makes. However, it is easier to get those streaks because of the intensity of that pressure point. If I use it more on its side, it will minimize that. And these are made in different sizes. This is about a medium size. You can get them much larger, so if you're blending large areas and you really want to minimize those stroke marks, I would go for a bigger one. They also make them tiny, tiny for little details like shading around a human eye or things that require a lot of precision. You don't want to go overboard. You don't want to go without that control. Okay. And next we'll go to our tissues here. Let's start with our facial tissue, or toilet paper will work in the same way. It's very, very smooth and it's very soft and pliable. So this is going to give a similar effect to what our finger did, but if you're concerned about applying those oils from your skin onto the paper, this will eliminate that completely. And it requires a little less pressure than that does as well, because the paper fibers in the tissue are pulling that graphite, pulling that pencil across the surface. I don't necessarily need to work quite as hard, which can generally be a good thing. And then, last but not least, is our paper towel, which has more of a grain to it. It's a bit more stiff and textured. You can tell just by looking at it. And when we pull that across the surface, it has a similar feel to the tissue, but it tends to have a little bit more of a textured effect when we get our result. And that will especially be more textured if we're working on a rougher surface paper. But actually, since this is a nice smooth sketching paper, I don't see too much of a difference there, which can be good to know too. If you're familiar with your materials, you'll know what to expect. If you know you're going to be working on the same type of paper, then you can go ahead and lean back on your previous experiences with those tools. Now let's apply some of the things that we just explored. I found a beautiful lemon in my icebox and made a quick sketch to find the edges of its main shape, plus the edge of the nice bold shadow beneath it here. I was careful not to over darken those edges, but sometimes things build up to be darker than I wish. So using my kneaded eraser here, I can gradually lighten up my line work just by pressing it onto the drawing. Also, I'll keep this eraser handy for adding highlights as needed onto my lemon later. That way, if I need to replace some bright spots, if I shade and things dim a little bit more than I want them to, I can always use this to pull up those pale grays and make those nice bright highlights reappear. So next I sectioned off some of my main values. I'm not worried about every single light and dark variation in my lemon. I just want to keep things simple. I don't want to be overwhelmed. So I picked out 4 values ranging from very dark to the bright white of the paper. And I found the bottom edge of the lemon to be dark, but not as dark as that shadow. And then that area just above it, which isn't quite the brightest white highlight, but I shaded that in using that pressure control and just giving a very thin layer of the pencil. So now that I have those tones already laid in, now I can start to rework them. I can manipulate them and kind of push them to what I really want to get things more and more precisely looking like my lemon here. So for example, this bottom shadow underneath, it is very dark and it does have a nice shape to it. However, I noticed that right where the lemon meets the table, the beginning of that shadow is super dark. And then as I get to the bottom edge of the shadow itself, it's very soft. It kind of dissolves into the brightness of the table. So now that I have this base area already filled in, I can go in with my pencil and I can firstly really darken up that edge where the lemon meets the table. But then as I blend that downward, I won't necessarily keep it as dark because I want that smooth transition, and I want this bottom edge of the shadow to be lighter than what I'm working on right now. And I could really dig in and make it super dark, because this is the darkest thing that I see in my lemon. And then noticing the bottom edge is still pretty crisp compared to the softness of this. So now what I can do is start to polish over that edge. I could either add a light layer with my pencil, or I could even take a piece of that tissue or the toilet paper that I was using earlier, and I could use that to kind of scrub away and polish the bottom edge, which saves me a lot of time and energy, but it also gives me a lot of control. I don't have to worry about leaving little streaky marks from using the pencil. If I feel like there's not enough moving, I could even take this tissue and kind of grab that pencil and pull it down. And then polish it through. So starting with these main areas, with these very basic, simple parts, then I could refine them as I go to make them closer and closer to what I want. Now that I've softened this bottom edge of the shadow, this top part also looks like that should be soft. So I'm going to go along the top edge here And do the same thing, grabbing and pulling that material and then polishing it from side to side. And having a nice strong shadow tends to work really well in giving that three-dimensional pop. So that object, that drawing, looks like it's really sitting on that surface as opposed to being just a flat shape on my page. So now that I've been polishing this shadow, I can keep on going and do more over this other edge here too. But for now, what I want to do is start to soften some of these areas in the lemon itself. And we can get something similar and smooth as well. So here, where it's very, very bright and it moves and meshes into this slightly darker area, here I have an abrupt change because I just kept it a simple shape. So let's take a fresh piece of our tissue and we'll go ahead and polish along that edge too, so that we won't have such an abrupt change from tone to tone. And I don't need to use a lot of pressure. I can slowly build up more and more pressure as I work, but it's always best to start with just a little bit, just like I'm kind of buffing, polishing it into the surface. And that keeps me from damaging the paper, but it also keeps me from going too far too fast and adding more streaks instead of removing them. Also, if I go a little bit beyond the edge of the lemon, that's okay. I can just take my eraser and clean up some of those smudgy bits that have gone beyond the limits, beyond the edges of the lemon. And while I'm at it, I can also start to polish the transition from here to here using my tissue, or using my finger would work too. But I'm going to keep using that tissue because I really like the softness that it affords me. And the more we add our shading of the different areas of shadow, the more we can get a better feel for the shape of our object. And thinking about the shape of the object as we shade is very, very important in keeping things looking natural and convincing. And the closer we can get to what we see, the more we could trick the eye into thinking we're looking at a real object as opposed to a drawing of one. Ooh, I'm getting closer. As I smooth out those different values and mesh them together, they give the lemon more of a volume and more of a realistic look. And as I softened up my shadow and really, really darkened up that edge under the lemon, it makes it give more of a realistic pop off of the surface. And the more I look, the more I see. Now that I look at my lemon again, I see those little dimples, those little pockets of texture, and I can go in and add those either with my pencil or with my eraser or a little bit of both. Also, I noticed that the table itself, the value of the table, is darker than the value of the top edge of the lemon. So instead of having that line to define it, I can start filling in that background, just making sure that the table does not become darker than the shadow. And if it does, then I know I have to darken that to keep everything in its proper proportion. Thank you again so much for joining me today. Stay safe, be well, and happy shading.